Someone's trying to kidnap me. Those were the chilling words that escaped April Millsa's lips one quiet evening, as she found herself trapped in a nightmare that seemed impossible to escape. For weeks, a man had been shadowing her every move, appearing at the bus stop, lingering outside her workplace, and watching from across the street. At first, it seemed like a harmless coincidence, but soon, the stalking escalated to something far more sinister. With each passing day, April's fear grew, until one night, the man made his move, and the true horror of what he had planned was revealed. April Millsa had always considered herself a cautious person. She lived in a quiet apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, tucked away in a neighborhood where everyone seemed to know everyone. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors greeted each other by name. She worked in an office downtown, a job that involved long hours but little excitement. After a typical day, she would catch the same bus, make the short walk home, and settle into her peaceful routine. But that all changed on one ordinary Tuesday afternoon. It started as just another day. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. April had finished her work and was making her way to the bus stop, her mind already focused on what she would make for dinner that evening. As she approached the stop, she noticed a man standing at the corner of the street. He wasn't unusual looking. Just an average middle-aged man in a worn jacket with scruffy hair and dark eyes. At first, April didn't think much of him. The city was filled with strangers, and people stood at street corners all the time. But as she walked past him, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was staring at her. It wasn't the kind of glance you'd expect from someone who was simply passing by. No, this felt different. It was a prolonged, intense stare that made April uncomfortable, as if the man knew her, or worse, was trying to get her attention. She quickened her pace, hoping to shake off the feeling, but as she reached the bus stop, she noticed the man hadn't moved. He was still standing there, his eyes now fixed on her from across the street. Something about his gaze made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end, but she brushed it off, trying to convince herself that it was nothing. The bus arrived soon after, and April climbed aboard, finding a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away from the curb, she glanced back and saw the man still standing there, watching her with an eerie intensity. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly turned away, trying to focus on the city scenery passing by. But the unsettling feeling lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't leave her side. She couldn't shake the thought that the man had been watching her for longer than she realized. For the next few days, the man seemed to appear wherever she went. It started innocently enough, at the same bus stop, at the same time, watching from the corner as she approached. At first, April thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he just took the same route, or maybe he worked nearby. But then it started happening more frequently, in places she didn't expect. He was there when she left work, standing on the sidewalk, his eyes fixed on her. And when she made her way to the grocery store, there he was again, standing in the parking lot, watching from a distance. Each encounter left April feeling more and more unsettled, as if she were being followed. The logical part of her brain told her it was all in her head, that she was overreacting. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. She began to change her routine, taking different routes home, hoping to lose him. But no matter what she did, the man always seemed to be there, lurking in the background, watching her every move. The sense of dread that had settled in her chest was growing stronger with each passing day. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being hunted, and the thought haunted her as she tried to sleep at night, tossing and turning under the weight of her growing fear. For days, April couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The man seemed to know exactly where she would be, always appearing at the bus stop, at the corner of her street, or even near the entrance to her office. It was as if he was always one step ahead, anticipating her every move. At first, she tried to convince herself it was just coincidence, that she was imagining things. But as the days wore on, the man's presence became more and more unsettling. The more she tried to ignore him, the more she found herself looking over her shoulder, waiting for him to appear. One afternoon, after finishing her shift at the office, April decided to walk home instead of taking the bus. The thought of being alone in her apartment, away from the constant feeling of being watched, felt comforting. As she made her way down the street, her footsteps echoed in the quiet neighborhood. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. When she turned the corner to her street, she saw him standing across the road, just like he had been the past few days. But this time, there was something different in his posture. He wasn't just standing there, looking distant like before. No, this time he was leaning against a lamppost, his eyes fixed directly on her. A shiver ran down April's spine, and for the first time, she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that had been building inside her. She kept walking, her pace quickening, but the man didn't move. He just stood there, watching her, unmoving. April's heart raced, and her mind screamed at her to be cautious, but she had no idea what to do. Should she cross the street and go the long way around? Would he follow her if she tried to escape? She glanced around, but there were no other people nearby. It felt as if the entire world had gone silent, and she was the only one caught in this terrifying web. As she reached the entrance to her apartment building, she looked back one more time. The man was still there, his eyes never leaving her. April quickly fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking, trying desperately to get inside. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, she felt a sense of fleeting relief. But it didn't last. The gnawing fear that had been growing inside her refused to let go. She knew something wasn't right. She couldn't keep ignoring the growing sense of dread that had followed her everywhere. That night, as she sat in her small, dimly lit apartment, April tried to distract herself by watching television. But every noise, every creak of the building seemed amplified, and she jumped at the slightest sound. It wasn't until she heard a knock at her door that her heart nearly stopped. She had no visitors planned, no reason for anyone to be at her door. Hesitantly, she stood up and peeked through the peephole. No one was there. The hallway was empty, eerily still. But as she turned back to her living room, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. A small note, taped to her door. With trembling hands, April peeled it off. The words written in thick, jagged letters made her stomach turn. "You're mine, and you'll be mine soon." Her mind raced, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't understand what was happening. The police, when she called them, dismissed it as a simple prank or some harmless threat. But deep down, April knew this was anything but harmless. Someone was watching her, and they had no intention of letting her go. What started as a distant figure following her steps had become something much darker, a nightmare that she couldn't wake from. As the hours passed, April couldn't sleep, her mind constantly returning to the note. What did it mean? Who was this person, and what did they want with her? Fear consumed her, her pulse pounding in her ears as she curled up on the couch, too scared to move, too scared to close her eyes. April's life, once so routine and predictable, had now descended into a waking nightmare. The man, whose presence had once been a faint discomfort, had become an ever-looming threat. His constant stalking had turned from an occasional unsettling encounter into a terrifying pattern she could no longer ignore. It wasn't just his physical presence that unnerved her. It was the growing certainty that he knew far more about her than a random stranger should. The eerie sense of being watched, even when she was alone, haunted her every step. No matter how much she changed her schedule or tried to avoid familiar places, he always seemed to be there, lurking just out of sight. April began to notice small, strange things. On her way to work, she would often spot him standing across the street, hidden in the shadows of a parked car or a street corner, as if he were waiting for something. The pattern was becoming clearer by the day. He knew her routine. He knew exactly when she left for work and when she returned home. He was no longer just following her. He was tracking her movements with a disturbing precision. She had become his obsession. But it wasn't just his presence that disturbed her. It was the way he behaved when he saw her. There was no attempt to approach her, no conversation, no interaction. He would merely stare, his eyes cold and calculating, as if assessing her every move. Sometimes, he would just watch her from across the street, and other times, he would disappear the moment she made eye contact, as if he were playing some twisted game of cat and mouse. April couldn't escape the growing feeling that he was always one step ahead of her. No matter what precautions she took, no matter how many different routes she tried, he was always there. One evening, After work, April decided to change things up completely. She would take a longer route home, walking through unfamiliar streets, hoping to lose him. But when she arrived at her usual bus stop, there he was again, standing by the edge of the sidewalk. His eyes locked onto hers as she approached, and for the first time he smiled, a cold, twisted smile that sent a wave of nausea through her. She froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. Her mind raced as she quickly made her way to a nearby cafe, hoping to find safety in numbers. The whole way there, she kept checking over her shoulder, but he never followed her inside. The night was long, filled with restless thoughts and a constant nagging anxiety. The feeling of being watched intensified, even when she was in the safety of her own apartment. Every creak of the building seemed amplified, every distant footstep sending a fresh surge of terror through her. Her paranoia began to consume her. She started to leave her blinds closed, never opening the windows, terrified that he might be watching her from the shadows outside. The feeling of being trapped in her own home was suffocating. It was the note, however, that truly broke her. After days of eerie encounters, April finally found another note on her door. This time, it wasn't just a simple threat, it was personal. The message was clear. I know you're alone. You can't hide from me. You belong to me now. The words sent a chill through her entire body, a wave of cold fear that made her sick to her stomach. She knew now that it wasn't just a random stranger. It was someone who had been watching her for longer than she realized. Someone who knew everything about her life, her habits, her routines. The thought that her every move had been tracked, her privacy completely violated, left her feeling exposed and helpless. She contacted the police once again, but once again, her fears were dismissed. They told her to stay vigilant and suggested she change her routine, as though this would solve the problem. But April knew deep down that this wasn't a simple case of a stalker. This was something far darker, and she was no longer sure how much longer she could keep running from the invisible predator who seemed to know her better than she knew herself. The nightmare was only just beginning, and April felt herself slipping deeper into the abyss. The days blurred together as April continued to feel the weight of the growing fear that had become her constant companion. The man, who she had begun to think of as her stalker, her tormentor, seemed to be everywhere. No matter what she did, no matter where she went, he was there, lurking in the background, watching her with that same cold, unblinking gaze. It wasn't just the physical presence anymore. It was the overwhelming sense of helplessness that accompanied every moment of her life. She felt trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Despite the police's dismissive attitude, April had started taking matters into her own hands. She installed extra locks on her doors, bolted the windows shut, and even considered moving to a different apartment. But even with these measures in place, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being suffocated by her own fear. Each time she went out, she felt the eyes of the man on her, tracking her every movement, and each time she returned home, she was met with a familiar dread. Was he waiting for her? Had he found a way inside? The nights were the worst. The thought that he could be lurking in the shadows, just outside her door, waiting for her to slip up, kept her up long after the lights went out. But one night, everything changed. April had just returned home after a particularly exhausting day at work. The day had been no different than the others. Work, lunch alone, awkward glances from strangers, and a long bus ride home. As she entered her apartment building, she felt the weight of her exhaustion settling in, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the usual shiver of fear as she walked through the dimly lit hallways. She told herself that maybe, just maybe, she had been imagining things all along, that her mind had created the stalking to cope with the anxiety of her routine life. But when she opened her apartment door, she was greeted with something far worse than she had ever feared. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to make her heart race as her mind tried to make sense of the sight in front of her. April's first instinct was to run, to leave the apartment and seek help, but her feet seemed frozen to the floor. She cautiously stepped inside, her every nerve on edge. The apartment was eerily quiet. The lights were off, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. The stillness was suffocating, but it was the odd, off-putting feeling that something was wrong that made her stomach churn. It wasn't until she reached the living room that she saw it, the unmistakable, familiar shape of a note on her coffee table. Trembling, April approached it, each step feeling heavier than the last. The paper was slightly creased, and the words were scrawled in that same jagged handwriting she had seen before. "You're getting closer to me. I'm closer to you than you think." A cold sweat broke out on April's forehead. The message made her stomach turn. How had he gotten inside? How had he breached the one place she thought was safe? The only explanation was that he had been inside the whole time, watching, waiting for her to return. And now he knew she was home. As the reality of the situation hit her, April's panic began to surge. She rushed to check every corner of the apartment, every closet, every window, but found nothing. The apartment was empty. There was no sign of anyone else, no physical trace of the man's presence, yet the feeling of being violated hung in the air like a thick fog. How could he have gotten in without leaving a trace? The thought sent a wave of dread coursing through her veins, and she realized the terrifying truth. The man wasn't just stalking her from the outside. He had found a way inside her life, and now he was playing a sick, twisted game with her. April had no more energy left to keep pretending she was safe. The rules of her world had shifted. She wasn't just dealing with a random stalker. This was someone who was calculated, methodical, and dangerously close. Her sense of control was slipping away, and the once familiar world outside her door had turned into a labyrinth of fear. The walls of her apartment now felt like the walls of a prison, and she was the one trapped inside, waiting for the inevitable next move. The truth was clear now. She wasn't going to outrun him. She wasn't going to outsmart him. And with every passing hour, her nightmare seemed to grow darker, more suffocating, and closer to the edge of something she wasn't sure she could survive. The feeling of being trapped was now an inescapable part of April's reality. Her apartment had become her prison, the walls closing in with every passing minute. She had installed security cameras, changed her locks again, and tried to keep a low profile. But nothing seemed to make a difference. The man was still there, watching, always one step ahead of her. He knew her every move, her every hesitation, and with each passing day, April felt more and more suffocated by the relentless tension in her life. It was in the middle of one sleepless night, when the weight of her fear was at its peak, that April finally made the decision that had been gnawing at her for days. She couldn't keep running from the unknown. She had to confront it. The endless evasion, the constant anxiety, it was driving her to the edge. It was time to take matters into her own hands and find out exactly who this man was and what he wanted from her. She couldn't live in this shadow of fear any longer. The powerlessness was too much to bear. April spent the next few days obsessing over every detail of the man's behavior. She reviewed every piece of evidence. The notes, the encounters, the sense of being watched, and something clicked. She wasn't dealing with a random stalker. She had made a mistake by assuming that he was simply a stranger. No, this was someone who knew her, someone who had been close to her life for longer than she realized. The realization sent a cold chill down her spine. The man's stalking wasn't a random act of obsession. It was personal. The breakthrough came when she recalled a moment from her past that she had buried deep within her mind. Years ago, before her life had become so mundane, she had been in a brief relationship with a man named Ethan. The relationship had ended on bad terms, with both of them moving on quickly. But the nagging suspicion that lingered in the back of her mind now seemed to take form. Could it be him? Could Ethan have returned, obsessed with her in a way she never could have imagined? April's heart raced as she dug deeper into the possibility. She dug through old photos, social media accounts, and even reached out to a few of her old friends from that time. What she uncovered was chilling. Ethan had always been possessive, jealous, and prone to obsessive behavior, even back then. She hadn't realized just how toxic his obsession with her had been until now. He had followed her every move back then, showing up uninvited at her workplace, her favorite hangouts, until she'd been forced to cut off all contact. And now, years later, it seemed that he had resurfaced, stalking her in a far more dangerous way. Realizing the true extent of the danger April was in, she made a decision. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to confront him before he made the next move. The fear that had consumed her for so long morphed into a new kind of determination. She would not let him destroy her life. She was going to take control of the situation. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and preparation. April carefully planned every step, every phone call, every action. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. She set up a meeting with her old friends to gather information on Ethan's whereabouts and even enlisted a private investigator to help track him down. The reality of her plan hit her hard. Confronting Ethan meant putting herself in even more danger, but she had no other choice. The night before her planned confrontation, April sat alone in her apartment, staring at the security camera feed that now monitored every corner of her home. It was silent, but she knew that Ethan could be watching her, waiting for her to slip up. Her heart pounded as she tried to keep her mind clear, but the fear still lingered, clawing at her. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. She was finally taking back control. When she finally faced him, face to face, she wasn't sure what would happen. But one thing was certain. She was no longer going to be the victim in this twisted game. She had found the strength to fight back, and no matter the outcome, she would not let fear win.